I investigate apartment 3B and now I'm just a character in its story Reddit drama story. Before I ever crossed the threshold of apartment 3B, the walls already whispered things. Not in the literal sense. No voices or eerie howls, nothing you could call paranormal. Just the subtle weight of stories that clung to the doorknobs and floorboards like old perfume. The kind of presence that made you stop and wonder who had stood here before you, which hearts had broken against these walls, what truths were buried under coats of beige paint. I moved into the building because it was cheap, and because cheap always comes with a catch. The catch here wasn't obvious at first. The building stood 3 stories tall, a stubborn block of faded brick in a gentrifying neighborhood full of craft beer and yoga mats. From the outside, it looked like a place where nothing ever really happened, the kind of building that quietly existed in the background of someone else's story. But inside, behind chipped doors and crooked mailboxes, lives were unfolding with the intensity of something theatrical. Especially in 3B. I'd been there only 2 weeks when the first note slid under my door. It wasn't signed, just a short line written in hurried handwriting. Don't trust what she says. No name, no explanation, no context. Just that. I didn't know who she was. At that point, I'd barely met anyone. I'd seen the woman in 3A once on the stairs. Tall, wary, with anxious hands that clutched her phone like it might bite her. The couple in 3C were always arguing, their words bouncing like rubber balls down the hall. And 3B, oh well, 3B had been empty, as far as I knew. The super told me the last tenant left abruptly, and that it was still waiting for renovation. Yet every night, faint sounds came from behind its door. Drawers opening, footsteps, a chair scraping the floor. Not loud, not constant, just enough to let you know someone was there, and they didn't want you to know. The second note came 3 days later. She's not who she says she is. Still no name, but now it felt like the first line of a longer conversation. My curiosity swelled in the same place where unease began to root itself. I started watching 3B more closely, loitering by the mailboxes a little longer than necessary, listening for keys in the lock or the whisper of footsteps inside. On a Thursday evening, I finally saw her. She came out with a bag of trash, her head down, her movements efficient and sharp. Shoulder-length hair, dyed too dark, as if hiding from something. She didn't look at me, didn't glance sideways, didn't pause. Just walked down the hall like someone in a hurry to leave behind a scene they shouldn't have witnessed. I didn't speak to her then. I just watched. But something about the way she avoided the light, the way she didn't seem to breathe in the hallway like the rest of us. It lingered in my mind. That night, another note. She's rewriting everything. That's when I started to keep a notebook. It felt foolish at first, like playing detective in a life that didn't belong to me. But the notes were coming regularly now. Under the door, sometimes tucked in between flyers in the mailbox. Once inside a library book I hadn't even borrowed. Always the same hand, always vague and urgent. The mystery was both thrilling and deeply uncomfortable. It's one thing to witness someone else's life unraveling. It's another to feel like you've been drafted into the mess without your consent. I couldn't tell if the notes were about the woman in 3B or someone else entirely. I started researching the building, not online. There was nothing unusual there. But in old newspaper archives at the public library, I found a clipping from 10 years ago. A small story, buried deep. Local teacher found dead in apartment after apparent overdose. The address was my building, the unit 3B. Her name was Grace Elwood. No follow-up article, no photos, no obituary, just a name and a silence around it. I asked the super about her. He went unusually quiet, then said, "That was a long time ago. People move on." But his eyes said something else. They said, "I remember. I just won't say it out loud." The more I asked, the colder people got. Neighbors who once nodded now looked away. One even muttered, "It's best not to dig. You won't like what you find." That's when I knew I wouldn't stop. Because now it wasn't just about the woman in 30B. It was about why everyone acted like she wasn't there, even though we all heard the footsteps. It was about who was leaving the notes, and why they wanted me to know. And it was about Grace Elwood. The name no one spoke, the woman who once lived in the same space where someone else now pretended to start fresh. I finally knocked on her door. Not out of bravery, but out of the slow, pressing madness of not knowing. She opened after a long pause, just a crack. Her eyes scanned me like a barcode. I asked, "Are you Grace?" She didn't answer, just stared, then shut the door. No slam, just the quiet thud of a chapter refusing to open. That night, another note. She took her life to erase someone else's. My notebook was full now. Scribbles, theories, diagrams. I'd drawn timelines, made connections that probably didn't exist. But something about that last note hit different. It implied a theft, not of identity, but of memory. That someone was rewriting history by inhabiting someone else's story, and maybe that someone wasn't doing it for the first time. I wondered if the woman in 3B was Grace, or if she had replaced Grace, or if someone else had replaced both. My mind spiraled. Every detail became suspect. The chipped key I'd found under my welcome mat, the voicemail from a wrong number that said, "It's done," and hung up, the library book with 2 pages missing. These weren't random. They couldn't be. One morning I woke up to find my notebook missing. Nothing else was touched. Not the laptop, not the wallet on the table. Just the notebook, gone. In its place, on the kitchen counter, was a note. Short, sharp, final. "Now it's your turn." And suddenly the building was too quiet. The footsteps from 30B stopped. The lights from under the door went dark. It was like she vanished. Or maybe I had, because from that day on, the neighbors stopped looking at me. The super forgot my name. My mail arrived late, sometimes opened. The hallway mirror reflected me slower than it should have. I became invisible in the same way the woman in 3B had been. And now I wonder, was the story ever hers? Or did I walk into something meant for someone else? A cycle repeating, waiting for another body to hold the weight of what was never said. I stopped trusting my own reflections the day after the notebook vanished. There was something imperceptibly wrong with the way my face looked back at me. Too still, like it was waiting for me to catch up to something it already knew. I stared longer than usual, trying to detect the inconsistency, but it wasn't in the features. It was in the silence behind them, in the hollowness of the eyes that should have been mine but felt borrowed. Everything since that last note had tilted sideways. The neighbors who used to mutter greetings in the hall now gave me the sort of glance you reserve for someone whose name you've forgotten, even though you never knew it to begin with. The woman in 30A crossed the landing without a nod. The couple in 30C no longer fought loud enough to be heard. Either they were gone, or their noise had been swallowed by something deeper. I knocked on the super's door. He opened just enough to fill the gap with his bulk and said, "I don't have a Unit 3B on my list." His tone was flat, automated, like a pre-recorded response. I told him I'd spoken to the tenant myself. He blinked as if buffering, then replied, "You mean that place that's under renovation? No one's lived there since the Elwood girl. You sure you're not confusing it with 2B? I wanted to laugh, but the silence afterward made it impossible. It wasn't just that he was denying something I'd seen with my own eyes. It was the way he looked at me while saying it. Like he needed me to believe it for my own good. Like he wasn't denying it because he didn't know, but because he did. I started writing again, but this time I kept everything digital. Password-protected files, cloud backups, printed pages hidden in the ceiling tiles. I wasn't taking chances. Every thread of the story I could remember went in there. Grace Elwood, the notes, the woman in 30B, the way her presence seemed to warp reality around her like heat off asphalt. I wrote down the number on her mailbox 8. Just the number 8. No initials. I checked the other mailboxes. All had names or initials, except hers. That same day, I saw someone slipping an envelope into that box. A tall man in a long coat, face partially obscured by a cap. He didn't glance around, didn't hesitate. Just placed the envelope inside and walked off like it was nothing. I waited until he left, then checked the box. It was locked. I went upstairs and stared at her door, heart hammering. Was she still behind it? Was she ever? I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Nothing. I bent down and pressed my ear to the wood. The air beyond the threshold was still. Too still. It wasn't silence. It was the absence of existence, like the space beyond that door had folded inward on itself. I tried the handle. It turned. The door creaked open. I stood at the edge, uncertain whether I was entering someone else's home or stepping out of my own. The apartment looked lived in, but not fresh. It had the air of a place that had hosted lives without ever participating in them. Sparse furniture, muted colors, curtains half drawn, a coffee cup on the table with lipstick smudged on the rim, a coat hung on a hook by the door. The place had all the signs of presence, but none of the warmth. I walked inside. The floor didn't creak. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something metallic. I checked the bookshelf, empty. No books, just a photo frame turned backward and an unlit candle. I picked up the frame. It held a black and white photo, too faded to make out clearly. Just the outline of a woman standing in front of a mirror. The glass had warped the image so the woman's face was distorted, stretched sideways. Her eyes were where her cheeks should have been. I placed it back. The door shut behind me on its own. No breeze, no draft. Just the slow, certain click of isolation. I didn't panic. Not right away. I checked the hallway through the peephole. It looked normal. Then I turned back and realized something had changed. The coat on the hook was gone. So was the coffee cup. The furniture remained, but the details were being erased. I opened the bedroom door. It was empty. Not just devoid of furniture, but entirely blank. White walls, white ceiling, white floor. It didn't match the rest of the apartment. I blinked. When I opened my eyes, there was something on the wall. A sentence, scrawled in faint graffiti. Memory isn't proof. I stepped closer. The wall rippled. Just slightly, like the surface of water before a drop. I blinked again. The sentence was gone. I backed out and closed the door. Every fiber of me said to run, but the front door wouldn't open. Not locked, just uncooperative. Like it wasn't a door anymore, more like a wall pretending. I turned around and sat down on the couch. There was a notebook on the coffee table. My notebook, the one that had been stolen. I flipped through it. My handwriting, my entries. But some pages I'd never written. Pages that recounted things I hadn't seen, thoughts I hadn't had, and dates. Dates from years ago. Before I moved in. Before Grace Elwood. One page ended with a signature GE. I dropped the book. The room pulsed. The light dimmed. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. But when I looked, nothing. Just the mirror on the wall. The mirror I hadn't noticed until now. It wasn't large, but it was centered. Framed in ornate metal vines that curled into each other like clenched hands. I walked toward it. My reflection was delayed. A half-second behind. Then it caught up. But it didn't match me. My reflection wore different clothes. My reflection blinked at the wrong time. My reflection smiled. I did not. I stepped back. The reflection stayed. It mouthed something. I couldn't hear the words. I turned away, heart racing. In that moment, the front door creaked open. I ran to it, threw it wide, and stepped into the hallway. But it wasn't my hallway. The wallpaper was wrong. The light fixtures were wrong. The door across from me read 30B. I turned around. The door I had just exited now read 3D. I stood there frozen while someone exited the unit beside me. A woman, shoulder-length dark hair, pale. She looked at me and paused. "Are you okay?" she asked, voice weary. I nodded slowly. "You just came out of Grace's apartment," she said, almost accusing. I didn't answer. I walked past her, down the stairs, out the front door. The street outside was unfamiliar. The buildings were wrong. The air smelled different, like ozone before a storm. I reached for my phone. The screen flickered, then died. I pulled out my keys. None of them had labels. None of them looked like the ones I remembered. I walked 3 blocks before realizing the people on the street were all staring at me. Not turning their heads, just already watching when I looked, each one with a blank expression, like mannequins waiting for the window display to change. I ducked into a cafe. The barista didn't greet me, just looked at me and said, "No substitutions today." I sat in the corner and opened the notebook again. The pages were all filled now. My handwriting, but none of the words were mine. On the last page, a new note. "You remembered too much. That's why she chose you." I looked around. The patrons in the cafe weren't moving. They were frozen mid-sip, mid-laugh, mid-blink, like paused footage. Then, one by one, they turned to face me all at once and smiled. Identical smiles. I fled, ran out the back door into an alley, heart pounding like war drums. I didn't know where I was anymore, or when, but one thing had become clear. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last, because apartment 3B wasn't a place. It was a doorway, a rewrite, a mirror that chose someone when the story needed telling again. Someone who remembered, someone who asked, someone who opened the door when they shouldn't have. And now it was my story. Except I wasn't the author. I was the draft, the next version. And somewhere, someone else had just found the first note. I stopped trying to leave the city after the third attempt ended exactly where it began. In front of the same rust-colored mailbox at the base of the building, with the same junk flyer for window tinting fluttering in the same crack between the metal and concrete. I tried to outsmart it, took random turns, changed direction mid-step, rode a stranger's cab without telling them where I was going, only to see the driver go silent and let the wheel move on its own until we pulled up again to 14 Marrow Street. Apartment 3B's building. The red bricks always gleamed a little more than the others on the block, not from polish but from something older, like memory, the kind that stains. I stopped pretending I could live normally. The city wouldn't let me leave, and the apartment wouldn't let me forget. Not that I wanted to, not anymore. Curiosity had long rotted into obsession. The only thing that kept me anchored was the thought that I wasn't entirely erased yet. I still knew my name, though sometimes it felt like wearing someone else's coat. Familiar, but not mine. People still spoke to me, though their words felt muffled, like I was hearing them through thick glass. One night, unable to sleep and more afraid of dreams than waking, I returned to the apartment. Not mine. The one above. 3B. Except now, the door was gone. Where there had once been wood and brass and a fading number, there was only wall. Smooth, featureless drywall. No seams. No hinges, like it had never existed. I pressed my palm to the surface and felt nothing. No warmth, no chill. Just an absence. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something wedged between the radiator and the floorboards. A photograph, curled at the edges, almost colorless. It showed a man standing in a doorway. Not 3B, but 3A. The door was wide open, and a woman was visible just inside, her back to the camera. I flipped the photo over. On the back, scribbled in pencil. She always chooses the neighbor. That detail cracked something open. It wasn't just the apartment. It was adjacency. Whoever, or whatever, 3B was, it needed proximity. It needed an audience, someone to witness the quiet unraveling of a life that didn't make sense. Someone close enough to hear the late-night creaks, to feel the bleed of something other into their own story. I realized then maybe I hadn't been chosen because I was special. Maybe I was just next door. I spent the next days gathering every scrap I could find. City records, tenant logs, online forums, even an old radio show that once investigated urban folklore. The patterns were scattered but there. Barely perceptible lines that traced tragedy after tragedy, always next to Unit 3B. Deaths, disappearances, breakdowns. Always neighbors. Always the ones close enough to hear the whispers. I even found a blog long since archived that mentioned Marrow Street by name. A post dated 2008 read, "My sister lived next to 3B. She said the walls thinned over time, that her dreams weren't hers anymore. When I finally visited, I saw someone else living in her body." The blog ended abruptly a week later. No further posts. No closure. I returned to the building again, each time noticing new distortions. The mailboxes now included mine twice. Same name. Same number. Different keys. The hallway lights flickered only when I walked beneath them. And once, I caught my reflection in the stairwell mirror lagging behind again. But this time, it didn't catch up. It just stood there, watching, smiling faintly. I walked backward down the hall, keeping my eyes on it until the angle broke and it disappeared. That night, the mirror in my own apartment cracked diagonally without cause. I didn't replace it. I didn't want to see what version of me might emerge next. Things got worse after that. Or maybe more honest. My apartment began shifting subtly. Drawers were rearranged. My books filled with underlined passages I never marked. One morning, I woke up with a handwritten page tucked beneath my pillow. A story. In my handwriting, but I hadn't written it. It began, "Woke up forgetting his own name, but remembered the woman in 3B. The paragraph ended with a question. When did the story become his? I didn't have an answer. And the more I read, the more I felt like the answer was already living inside me, just out of reach. I tried calling my brother. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Someone whose voice used to feel like a thread back to who I was. The call didn't connect. It didn't fail either. It simply held. A dead line. Like the number existed, but the voice on the other end no longer did. I looked up his address and went to find him. The house was boarded up. Neighbors said it had been abandoned for years. But I had photos, texts, emails, proof that we'd spoken recently. Except now those messages were gone. Deleted without trace. My inbox pristine and unfamiliar. That's when I began to feel it. The slow draining of everything that anchored me. Not all at once, but carefully. A steady siphon. Each day a little less mine. I stopped dreaming entirely, but started waking up with memories I didn't own. A picnic in a field I've never seen. A conversation with a mother who didn't resemble mine. A tearful confession in a church basement with a woman I don't recognize. These memories weren't fading in. They were being grafted, and they were stronger than my own. I began to fear that soon I wouldn't remember what was real. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that was 3B's purpose. To overwrite. To retell, to rehouse stories in fresh bodies, like nesting dolls whose contents shift with each opening. I went back one last time, or what I meant to be the last. I brought a hammer, a flashlight. My files. Every note I had ever written about the apartment. Grace Elwood, the notes, the mirror. I was going to destroy the wall where the door used to be. Not out of anger, but because I needed to know if there was still something behind it. I waited until the hallway was quiet, until the hour slipped past 3 a.m. When the building breathed deepest. Then I raised the hammer and struck. The wall cracked. Not just plaster. Beneath it a hollow thud. I struck again. The crack widened. Dust filled the air. I struck a third time, and the hammer went through. I dropped it and widened the hole with my hands. Behind the drywall was a room, small, windowless, lit by a single exposed bulb, and inside, against the far wall, was a chair. On it sat a woman, head bowed, hair dark, shoulders still. She looked up. Her face was mine, not just similar, identical, except oldered, worn from retellings. "You're early," she said, voice flat, familiar. I couldn't speak. She stood slowly. "It doesn't usually happen this fast. You must have dug too deep." I took a step back. She didn't follow, just stood there, calm. "I was the last one," she said. "Before you. Before Grace. Before all of them." "What is this?" "I finally manage," she smiled. "A relay. One life ends, another picks up the thread. Same story, different voice us." "Why me?" She tilted her head. "Because you listened. Because you stayed. Because you asked." I turned and ran. Out of the room, down the hall, past the flickering lights and the quiet mailboxes and the stairwell that suddenly seemed deeper than it ever had. But when I reached my door, it was locked. The key didn't fit. My nameplate was gone, and behind me the hallway was empty. No 3B, no 3A, no 3C. Just a corridor of endless doors, all numbered 3B. I picked what opened. Inside was my apartment. Or something like it. The furniture was wrong. The photos were all reversed. And the only item on the table was a notebook. Blank. Waiting. And I understood. I wasn't escaping. I was continuing. The story wasn't about a haunted apartment. It never was. It was about narrative hunger. About the need to be remembered. The need to be retold. 3B was a story engine. A ghost, not of a person, but of a tale that refused to end. And now it was mine to carry, until the next neighbor moved in, until someone else heard the footsteps, until another notebook was filled. I stopped counting the days after the calendar in my kitchen reset itself. Not to January 1st, not to the beginning of a year, but to a date that didn't exist. March Youth. New year, no weekday, just a void where time should begin. Every attempt to correct it failed. I pinned a new calendar. The next morning, the pages were blank. I set the date on my phone. It reset at midnight to Zauberfaudre. March zur emails arrive time, stamped with that date. Delivery orders I never made were marked, fulfilled, on March 0. Somewhere between the unraveling of the hallway and the cracking of the mirror, time itself had become part of the story. And stories, I was learning, had no obligation to follow rules, especially not ones about chronology, especially not once you were inside them. I tried to mark the days manually, tallies on the wall, notches on my desk. But those too vanished. Sometimes replaced with different numbers. Ones I didn't recognize, sequences that looked like dates but weren't from any calendar I knew. Some scratched too deep into the wood, like they'd been made by someone desperate not to forget. Maybe me. Maybe not. I stopped using today in my thoughts. I started saying now, because it was the only thing I could feel anymore. And even now slipped sometimes. Now became a memory, became a prophecy, became someone else's experience leaking into mine. And there were others. That was the next thing I realized. Not just the others who'd come before me, but the ones here with me. Not in the physical sense. I never saw them. But I felt them every time I stood too long in a room and suddenly knew I was not alone. In the kitchen, the cabinet door would swing open and shut on its own, not randomly, with intention, with rhythm. 1, 1, 2, as if tapping out code. I began listening. At first it was a game. A distraction from the truth that I no longer knew where my life ended and the apartment story began. But then, I started understanding the rhythm. Not the message itself, never the words, but the pattern. The plea, because that's what it was. Not malevolent, not angry, just desperate. Every echo in this building, every flicker of light, every creak of floorboard was someone screaming not to be forgotten. I opened the notebook again. The one that now seemed fused to the table. Its pages were fuller than I remembered. More entries, more loops. My name appeared less. Other names filled the gaps. Grace, Thomas, Leela. The one with the dog. The girl who watched from 20C. The boy who spoke in riddles. None of them meant anything, and yet reading them felt like remembering. I could picture them. Hear the cadence of their speech, the weight of their sighs, the tilt of their heads when they passed through the hall. As if I'd lived beside them once. As if we were all tenants in the same corridor of memory. One entry described a ritual, written like a recipe, like someone had hoped documentation would protect them. To pause the story, mirror, key, name, door, in that order. At 3 out of 33, aim only once, never twice. It sounded like superstition. But in a place like this, where reality bent so often it began to weep, superstition was structure. So I tried it. At 30:30, I turned off every light, waited. The apartment seemed to breathe slower. At 3:33, I faced the mirror. The new one. Not the broken one. I held the key I found behind the radiator. The one no lock ever fit. I said my name, slowly, out loud, 3 times. Then I opened the front door. What waited wasn't the hallway. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen. It was a stairwell, but endless, narrow and damp and red with rust. No railings, just stone steps spiraling downward into a hollow space that pulsed like a throat. I stood at the edge and felt my heart try to crawl out of me. Then I stepped forward. The air was thick, like trying to breathe in syrup. The walls were covered in handprints, not painted, pressed, stained. Each step echoed with a different sound, footsteps, laughter, a phone ringing, dog barking, a sob. But never mine. I couldn't hear my own feet. I descended. 40 steps. 60. I stopped counting at 100 when the staircase bent sharply into a new dimension, or at least that's what it felt like. The color of the air changed. Not the walls, the air itself. It became gold, then green, then a soft blue like twilight before memory. At the bottom was a door. Unmarked. Wooden. The kind you'd find in an attic no one used. I opened it without knocking. Inside was a room that looked like my childhood bedroom. Every detail perfect. The books on the shelf. The poster on the wall. The scratch on the desk where I'd once carved my initials. I walked in and felt like I'd been dunked in nostalgia. Not warm, but cold. Sharp. Because something was off. The photo on the dresser showed my family, but not as I remembered. My face was wrong, smiling too hard, and my brother wasn't in the photo. In his place was the woman from 3B, Grace, wearing his clothes, her hand on my shoulder. I backed away, but the room didn't let go. It pulsed again, throbbed like it was alive. I turned to leave, but the door was gone. Of course it was, replaced by a mirror. Floor to ceiling. In it, I saw myself, but wearing the clothes from the photo, standing the way the boy in the frame had stood. I mouthed something. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw them. Let it take you. I screamed. Hit the glass, it didn't break. Instead, it shimmered. And then, I fell forward. Into it. Through it, I landed back in my apartment. Exactly where I'd started. Same couch, same notebook. But now, I wasn't sure what version of me had landed. I checked the mirror. My reflection blinked in sync. But when I smiled, it didn't. It stared. It waited. That's when I knew. Whatever ritual I had attempted, whether it had paused the story or accelerated it, it had changed me. I wasn't the narrator anymore. I was a character. And the story was still being written. My memories became fragmented after that. Days began to repeat. Sometimes conversations replayed. I'd bump into the same neighbor twice in 1 hour, wearing different clothes. I'd open a door and find the same scene from yesterday playing again. Down to the flicker of the TV, the sound of the faucet, the hum of a forgotten kettle. Loops. Feedback. As if the story was glitching. And each time I noticed, I became more detached. My voice felt foreign. My thoughts arrived secondhand. I stopped dreaming about escape. Instead, I began to think about succession. About who would be next. About who would move in after me and hear the first knock, see the first note, feel the shift. Maybe the story wasn't about survival. Maybe it was about containment. Someone had to carry it. House it, keep it alive so it wouldn't rot in silence. And that someone was always the one who lingered too long in the hallways. Who read too deeply, who remembered too much. The story didn't feed on blood or fear. It fed on narrative, on the act of being told and retold. It fed on memory and the confusion between truth and fiction. The final entry in the notebook wrote itself. I swear I didn't hold a pen. It just appeared. The next one won't knock. They'll already have the key. That's when I heard footsteps outside the door. Slow, deliberate, a pause. Then the key in the lock turning. Click. I smiled without meaning to, because I understood now. This wasn't the end, just another chapter. And I was no longer the reader. I was the story, waiting to be read. The door didn't open right away. Not in the way doors typically do. It hovered in that uncanny middle state between invitation and denial, as if deciding whether the person on the other side was ready. Or perhaps it was me being measured, my presence assessed like a host deciding whether to let the guest in or be consumed instead. Eventually, it creaked ajar. A sliver, just enough for me to see the hallway, and for the hallway to see me. But no one entered, no footsteps crossed the threshold, no silhouette loomed. The silence that followed was dense, filled with anticipation. And then I saw it, a shadow, one that didn't match any visible figure. It moved independently, stretching across the floor like spilled ink seeking cracks. I should have run or fought, or at the very least braced myself. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped backward into the living room, which had rearranged itself again. The chair was now in the corner, the couch replaced by an armchair I'd never seen before. The air was different too, thicker, like breathing through fog. My hands trembled without cold. There was a presence here now, something ancient, something attentive. I sat, not out of comfort, but because standing felt like performing in front of an invisible jury. The notebook was on the table again, open to a page that hadn't existed before. It read, "When the guest arrives, you must decide. Tell the story or become it." My skin tightened. I understood now. This wasn't just a haunting or a rewriting or a cycle. It was a mechanism, an engine that needed fuel. And that fuel was narrative, attention, continuity. The story didn't survive unless it was passed on. And the only way out, if there even was one, was to give it someone else. Someone new, a successor, a vessel. I remembered the words from the stairwell room. She always chooses the neighbor. But I had no neighbor now. The doors were gone. The hallway was an endless corridor of 3Bs. I was alone in a labyrinth of mirrored identities and recycled memories. And yet, the presence outside the door still waited. It wanted in. Or maybe it wanted me out. I approached the door slowly, footsteps muffled like sound itself had been turned down. My hand touched the knob. It was warm. Not from heat, but from awareness. Like it remembered every hand that had turned it. I pulled the door open. A young man stood there, hesitant, backpack slung over one shoulder, key in hand. His face was unfamiliar and familiar at once, like a composite sketch from every version of this story. His eyes met mine. "Is this 3B? I not. You just moved in." "Yeah. Aight. Wait, aren't you the guy who left the note?" My pulse thumped. "What note?" He hesitated, then pulled something from his pocket. A slip of paper, wrinkled and yellowing. It read, "Don't trust what he says." My breath caught. That was the first note I'd ever received. But now it was addressed to me. The story had looped again. Or worse, it had refracted. "I found it in my mailbox," he said, "right after I signed the lease." I stared at him. Not because I was surprised, but because I finally saw it clearly. The story wasn't linear. It wasn't even circular. It branched like a tree, each new reader a limb, each interpretation a leaf. And now I was becoming part of the canopy. I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. He blinked thanks. As he walked past me, I saw the shadow slip in behind him. Not attached, not constrained. A third party to this transfer. Watching, approving, I closed the door. The air shifted. The apartment acclimated to its new participant. Furniture moved slightly. The lights dimmed and then steadied. The notebook closed itself with a soft snap. He sat down on the couch. My old couch, which had returned in place of the armchair. I stood behind him, unsure of what I was supposed to do. Or if I had any say left. "Weird question," he said. "But have you ever felt like this place is off?" I smiled without warmth.
Every day?
"Yeah, like I keep hearing this knock on the wall. 3 times. Always at the same hour." He looked at me. "You think it's the pipes or something?" "It's not the pipes." "You know what it is then?" I paused. The part of me that was still human wanted to warn him, to scream, to push him out and break the cycle. But the part of me that had already been absorbed, the part that was now ink in the margins, had other intentions. "Not yet," I said. "But you will." He didn't ask more. Just sat there, watching the apartment breathe. And I felt it again. That pull. The rearrangement, the handover, the subtle extraction of identity, transferring from one tenant to the next like passing a baton in a race no one remembered starting. I looked in the mirror across the room. My reflection stood alone now. He wasn't sensing with me anymore. He stood still, hands folded, staring at the new tenant. His mouth moved, silently. I couldn't read the lips, but I knew what he was saying. "This is yours now." That night, I slept for the first time in weeks. But the dreams were not mine. They were his. Images of childhood I didn't recognize: a hill, a dog with one ear, a hospital room filled with static. His memories, already leaking into me. I woke up with his name on my tongue. Ethan. The notebook confirmed it. New handwriting had appeared, his. Scribbled notes about strange neighbors, and the same flyer appearing every day, and the woman in the stairwell. The story had begun again. But I hadn't left. I was still here. Just not the narrator anymore. Not the protagonist. Something in between. The chorus, maybe. The footnote. The echo that gives depth to a scream. Over the next few days, I watched Ethan unravel. Slowly, like tissue in water. He paced the hallway more often. Asked questions no one answered. Stared too long at his own reflection. And then the notes began to appear for him. Different handwriting, different voice. But same message. "You're not alone." Ah. The mirror lies. Memory isn't proof. The same lines that once haunted me, now sent to him by someone else. Or maybe me. I wasn't sure anymore what I was capable of. The apartment began adjusting, shifting to accommodate his fears. The hallway light flickered when he approached. His mail vanished and reappeared in different boxes. One day he found a key that opened a door he swore didn't exist. I followed silently, a shadow to his descent, and when he opened the hidden room, the one I had once found beneath the staircase, it was no longer my childhood bedroom, it was his. Same desk, same scratches, same posters, but the photo on the dresser now showed me. Older, worn, smiling too hard. I stood behind him as he stared. He didn't turn. He didn't have to. "What is this place?" he whispered. I didn't answer, because it wasn't a question, it was an initiation, a password, a surrender, and the walls pulsed in approval. When he finally turned to face me, I was already fading, but transmuting into paper, into wall, into mirror. I would remain, but not as a person, as a chapter, as an annotation. The story doesn't let anyone leave. Not really. It lets you change form. The notebook began a new section that night. Fresh cover, new name, same title, Apartment 3B, Testimony of the Tenant, and I was on page 1 again, this time as a cautionary tale. My face in the margins, my voice in the tap of the pipes, my memory in the flicker of the hallway light. Ethan won't last forever. No one does. But someone always comes next. That's how stories survive. Not through endings. Through repetition. Through inheritance. Through the quiet knock at your door when you least expect it, and the whisper just beyond the keyhole. It's your turn now. I never knew how endings truly worked until I realized I'd become one. Not a person anymore, not even a presence, but a punctuation mark in someone else's sentence. Final, unavoidable, misunderstood. I used to believe stories closed like doors. Tidy, complete. Now I understand they collapse more like lungs at the moment of exhale, leaving behind the echo of breath and the silence it once interrupted. Ethan lasted longer than most. Weeks, maybe months, though time had lost its loyalty to sequence long before he arrived. The apartment tried him like it tries everyone. Gently at first, then with increasing weight, his dreams were the first to go. Not vanish, no. They were replaced. Repopulated. Instead of drifting through familiar landscapes, he began to walk through corridors filled with whispers and rooms that blinked. He told himself it was just stress. New job, new building, new surroundings. But deep down he knew. All tenants know. They just lie to themselves a little longer each day. The real shift came when he began losing time. Small, forgettable chunks at first, a missing hour, a misplaced morning. Then full days, entire conversations. He started writing notes to himself. Check stove. Call mom. Don't forget Thursday. But Thursday never came. It stayed one hallway turn away, always arriving in someone else's timeline. Eventually, he stopped leaving the apartment. Not out of fear, but because there was nowhere left to go. The outside world had begun decaying in the corners of his mind, its details smudged and blurry like old chalk. He paced more, stared at the mirror more, and each night he left the notebook open beside his bed like a prayer or an offering. I watched from inside it. By then, I no longer had a body. I was ink and page and shadow. My thoughts bled into margins. I could feel myself stretching between the lines, weaving into the story's spine. I tried to warn him, in the only way I could. I altered his entries, rewrote sentences while he slept. He'd write, "I heard a knock at midnight," and in the morning it would say, "She knocked because she remembered me." But he never noticed. Or if he did, he thought it was his own exhaustion playing tricks. The apartment began whispering in other voices. He told himself it was the plumbing. He wore headphones. Then the walls started breathing. He blamed mold or drafts or old construction. We all do, at first. The last true moment he had, before the fracture, before the dissolution, was a conversation with himself. I watched it happen. He stood in front of the mirror one morning and asked, "Are you still me?" And his reflection said nothing, just tilted its head, smiled, and blinked out of sync. That was the crack, the unsealing, the moment the story stopped adapting and began replacing. After that, he changed fast. His eyes dulled, but his movements sharpened. He smiled without context, sat in dark rooms, listened to walls like radios. I wrote pages he never saw, screamed into paper, scratched warnings into the wood of the table. But the story doesn't allow rescues. It only allows retellings. One morning, the apartment was empty, not in the usual way where someone leaves behind objects and impressions. Empty, as in reset. Stereo, the furniture returned to neutral. The light stabilized. The mirror, clean, unbroken, blank. The notebook sat closed on the table. A new cover, blank pages. And I knew then that Ethan had been processed, filed away, stored. A new footnote in the expanding archive of 3B. I didn't see where he went. I only felt his residue. Like mist, like a smell you can't name but recognize. That's what we become. After, a texture, a shadow cast in just the wrong direction. That's when the knock came. For the first time in what felt like decades, someone knocked. Not a tenant, Not a neighbor, a visitor. I couldn't see her, but I could feel her palm against the wood. Curious. Maybe she was a sister or a friend. Maybe just someone looking for a cheap place to start over. It didn't matter. The story had sent out its scent, and someone had followed. The door creaked open on its own. She stepped inside. I could sense the shape of her awe. The stillness of the room, the weight of its silence. The strange tug in her stomach that told her this place remembered her even though she'd never been here before. I wanted to reach out, tell her to run. But I had no mouth, no hands, just language, just suggestion. So I wrote. The notebook opened, the pen mine, his, someone's, moved. Don't stay long. Don't unpack. Don't listen to the mirror. She read it. I felt her fingers on the paper, felt the hesitation, the disbelief. She put the notebook down and walked through the apartment. Touched things, assessed them, made mental notes. She was thinking about paint colors, about rearranging furniture, about turning this into her home. She didn't know, not yet. But the apartment did. It adjusted subtly. Just enough. The thermostat shifted. The hallway light dimmed. The mirror caught her reflection and held it a second too long. And me. I felt myself pulled deeper. My voice diluted further. This was how the story preserved itself. Not through horror, through familiarity, through the illusion of a blank page, because people don't fear stories. They crave them. They walk into their jaws with open arms. By the end of the week, she would notice the drawer that never stayed closed, the nightstand that moved 2 inches every night, the strange taste in the water. By the end of the month, she would start forgetting names. Her own reflection would blink at the wrong time. She'd hear her voice played back to her in recordings she never made, and the notebook would fill again, slowly, reluctantly, until one day she opened to a page that said, "Now it's your turn," and she would know. And she would stay, and I would be pushed back once more, deeper into the folds of forgotten ink, until someone else picked up the story again. That's how it works. Apartment 30B doesn't haunt. It harvests. It archives. It builds itself on memory and repetition and the refusal to be left behind. And every tenant is a paragraph. Every neighbor a comma. Every knock a chapter break. So if you ever find yourself looking at a building that feels too quiet, with a door that seems to watch you more than you watch it, and rent that seems a little too low, ask yourself one thing before you sign: do you remember what came before you? Because if not, 3B is waiting. And it always has room for one more line. Enjoyed the video? Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you never miss an update.